as well. First of all, as you all know, for this class, make sure you guys all register. For those that have not registered, there should be a laptop or some sort of sign-in sheet being passed around as the class is going on. So please make sure you sign up and register for the class. For the last session, the first session that we had last week, the link is up. It's recorded, so we sent the link in the WhatsApp group, but it's also on YouTube if you just go to Islamic Center of South Bay, and you can see the first session there. So don't feel like I might be missing out. I didn't come the first time. No worries, it's recorded, it's online, so you can take a look there as well. And one thing that I forgot to do last week, and I apologize with that, is that I forgot to introduce him properly. So I know this is kind of like your first time here. He's coming from very far from Anaheim Hills. So we appreciate you driving out here and taking the time out. May Allah reward you immensely. But Ustad Fuad actually started his studies in Cairo and studying under teachers from Al-Azhar University. He has ijazats or licenses in many of the Islamic sciences. He also graduated from Bayan Claremont, and that's actually where I first met him. We met on a boat, and I know that sounds weird, but it was actually a pretty cool event. It was a cruise, a Bayan event, where they were showcasing some programs for Bayan Claremont, and also it was an event to gather some of the students there as well. And he also teaches at the Majlis as well, which is an institute also with Sheikh Jamal Diwan and Sheikha Muslima. So again, inshallah, we hope to see Ustad more in the future at our center, and I'll hand it over to the Ustad to continue the session. Assalamu alaikum.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه اللهم يا منور يا فتاح نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك إنك على كل شيء قدير اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وصلي اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We left off last week going through the مبادئ العشرة أعلم مبادئ كل فن عشرة الحد والموضوع ثم الثمرة نسبة فضله والواضع والاسم الاستمداد حكم الشارع مسائل وبعد بالبعد اكتفى ومن درج جميع حاز الشرف. So know for every knowledge there are 10 beginnings, and these are the 10 things that we come to know about the science in order to acclimate ourselves to what the science is all about. The first one is the definition, and we went over 2 definitions, and we talked about the fact that the definition for this science of Aqidah, is mainly 2 things. The first thing is we need to know what it is that we have to believe as Muslims. And the second thing that we have to know is why are those beliefs true? And so we have to have some level of understanding then that allows for us to be able to, in fact, grant that what we believe as Muslims is in fact true. The second thing is the mawdu', the subject. So what is the subject of ilm tawheed or aqidah? And the subject matter, as it goes through its variations in the post-classical period, comes to be understood as al-ma'loom. Al-ma'loom. And al-ma'loom means the intelligible. It means everything that can be known in order to arrive at the objectives that we have in this discipline, which is to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all of the things that deal with how to prove the foundational principles of Tawheed. And Tawheed for us, in terms of trying to give a proper definition, we'll go through it many more times throughout the course. But Tawheed literally means to make something one. And so in relationship to how we apply it to this science, it's maintaining or preserving our understanding of God's oneness. And so Within this science, then, we're going to be going through a number of subjects that allow for us to gain a grasp on how we come to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And those things are essentially three. So you can say that the subject of Tawheed or Usul al-Din, Aqidah, are three things. The first one is Ilahiyat, divinity. So we come to know God. The second one is Nubuwat, the prophets, or what we call prophetology. What is our understanding of prophets? What are prophets? And who is a prophet? And then the last one is Sam'iyat. And Sam'iyat are talking about that which can only be known through revelation. There are a number of terms that's used in this. In the academy, for instance, we call it eschatology. But beyond these really fancy terms, what we're really talking about here are what are the things that we come to know after we've accepted the Quran itself, after we've accepted the revelation itself. So fundamentally what we're after in this science is to come to understand what is necessary for Allah, what is impossible or inconceivable, we'll say, and what is conceivable. And if you don't know those terms yet, don't worry, we'll go through what each one of those things means. The third thing is the thamara. What's the fruit of the science? What do you get out of studying this? And the fruit of the science of Tawheed is you come to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ma'rifatullah. And when you know what is necessary, what is inconceivable for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the prophets, your acknowledgement then of the sharia becomes certain. I.e., like your faith won't be shaken because of something that is sort of within the branches of the science itself. So one of the things that we oftentimes neglect, especially when we're teaching children, and I think educators really should, we should have a discussion about this. When people ask why, when it comes to the religion, the answer of, well, that's just the way it is, isn't going to be sufficient for the future. But we also need to recognize when the question that we're asking doesn't really make all that much sense. Or what it is that we're actually trying to ask and maybe asking it in a way that doesn't properly capture that. If I were to say to you, for instance, hey, we have to pray dhuhr, what is that already assuming? Was what? It's afternoon? Okay. Yeah, time for salah. What's even more fundamental than that? What? Knows how to pray? Okay. What if I were to say, why do we even have to pray dhuhr? Okay, there it is. We're subordinate to a supreme power. So the assumption here is that we believe in a supreme power. Correct? And we've already worked all of that out. If we haven't, and we're unclear as to who that supreme power is, or what the relationship of that supreme power is to this particular text that's telling me I have to pray when the sun hits this particular place in the horizon, then I'm going to have some issues. Does that make sense? Praying dhuhr is a mandate that we come to know after we've accepted that there is a God and that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the messenger of God, and that the revelation of the Quran is in fact what we come to know as being what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed to us as human beings to do in our lives. If that hasn't been worked out and you're talking to somebody who they've never really thought about it before, and then you tell them, hey, we have to pray dhuhr, and then once in a while he's doing it, once in a while he's not doing it, and then out of the blue they ask, why are we even doing this? What are they really asking?
He's created humans, no matter he's a Muslim, Jew, Christian, atheist. He cares for him and he is his subject.
Yeah.
So,
But you came to know all of that. You came to understand all of these things that you're saying. What if somebody hasn't done all of that? I mean, I imagine that there's something that, you have gone through, mashallah, tabarakallah, you seem like you have a lot of experience in your life. You seem like you've gone through those things that have allowed for you to inculcate that understanding. But if a 15-year-old asks you that question, they haven't gone through those things. And most of the time in our communities, they're just told, this is what you do. So they don't have an understanding of what is the foundation of this to begin with. Like, why are we even doing any of this? It's kind of fun, but there's a lot more things that I could think of that could be fun to be doing right now. So, why? So the question of why, oftentimes, especially when it's trying to tackle an issue from within the furu' of the religion, within the branches of the religion, it's actually a foundational question. It's a question about belief. And that's what I'm trying to get us to come to recognize in a way. That these foundational things, they have to be worked out. And if not, they'll come out in these questions or these things that, then oftentimes leave us incapacitated in a way to be able to reconcile them for others. So, we can also say that there's a fruit in this world and there's a fruit in the next world. The fruit in this world is that when you have certainty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His regulations upon you, you will have order on all levels that in fact will sustain humanity. So when you know this, you come to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have that supreme power, you recognize that there's something that transcends you, and as an implication, you'll treat the world around you in that manner, which is the objective of what Aqidah is trying to get us to realize. تَعْبُدَ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ, that you worship God as if you see Him. وَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَاهُ فَهُوَ يَرَاكَ, and if you can't see Him, then at least you know that He sees you. Imagine if everybody was actualizing that in their day-to-day. And this also deals with a number of things. It doesn't just deal with our relationship with other people. It deals with our relationship with the creation as a whole. So the way that we treat the environment, the way that we treat animals, and our concern for those things then will naturally elevate. Which is the reason why that hadith of the Prophet ﷺ talking about the one who pursues knowledge, the animals and even the fish in the seas make istighfar for that person. And as a commentary upon that hadith, they say the reason is because one who seeks knowledge is in fact then guaranteeing the longevity, the sustainability of even the fish in the sea. And they recognize that. And there's an element of justice within that. That the more that you come to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more just you will be with Allah's creation. And just not in the sense that, we have to understand it from within our tradition. When we talk about justice, we're actually talking about something that preserves balance in the world. Wisdom, essentially speaking. Knowing, as one scholar said, when to put a foot forward and when not to. Being able to put things in their proper places. And so this science then establishes your ability to recognize where all of those things lay. بإذن ta'ala. The fruit in the next world is Jannah. بإذن ta'ala. Paradise. What's the nisbah? What's the category of the science? How does it relate to the other sciences? So it's the basis of all the knowledges within the Islamic sciences. Tawheed requires an encompassing scope of knowledge, and the others are much more specific. So like a mufassir of the Quran, somebody who is an exegete, who does commentary on the Quran, that's their role. A muhaddith is a person who looks at hadith. An usuli looks at evidence-based proofs. Usul is a methodological science within our religion, etc. But the theologian, the mutakallim, the person who does theology, they look at everything that is knowable. Al-ma'lum, as we said before. And it's divided again into what we come to know as pre-eternal. That word is a little bit problematic, but qadim wal hadith. Okay? Pre-eternal, that which doesn't have a beginning, doesn't have an end, so on and so forth. You come to recognize that that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What's the fadl, the virtue of this science? The virtue of this science is that it's the most noble of all the sacred knowledges, and it's the highest science. It's the highest in rank. It corrects your outlook on your purpose, and it's a science that is sought for itself. And the reason is because the science is knowing Allah. And so, as an implication, it then deals with what we call qat'i texts. Texts that are unequivocally understood. Like what? Like قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Say that God is uniquely one. There's no ambiguous connotation to that idea. God is uniquely one. Like you couldn't say well, maybe he's two. Maybe that verse is saying he's kind of two. There's no way to say that, right? Qat'i. It's well understood. Now, there's a long discussion that we could go on here in relationship to this methodology, but just know that there are verses in the Quran and in the Sunnah, texts, okay, from within our source texts, that are qat'i, and then there are texts that are dhanni. There are texts that are unequivocally understood and known, and there are texts that are ambiguous, one can say, right? In other words, they hold or they can accommodate more than one meaning in relationship to what that proposition is. One of my teachers actually told me that the makeup of the Quran and the text itself is comprised of maybe 5 to 10% qat'i. Meaning 5 to 10% of the text itself are unequivocal statements. There's only one way to understand it. Which means that the rest of the 90% is open to interpretation. Hence the reason then why you have these different schools of thought that came in to try and come to an understanding, derive what it is that the Quran was actually saying, and then stay consistent within their methodology. And that's actually something that, goes into what makes one, very, qualified in order to actually go into these texts and be able to derive meanings that would then imply what we should be doing legally speaking. All right? Fakhruddin al-Razi, rahimahullah, said that the Quran, it can be divided into 4 things, 4 categories. The first category are those verses that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what they mean. Like what? Alif Lam Mim. Right? Hamim. These verses. Allah only knows. Then there are verses where the Prophet ﷺ or a prophet would have to explain what they mean. The third is that you have verses where ulama and tulab ilm, students of knowledge, would be required in order for you to derive what those things mean. And the fourth category is everybody can derive what they mean. What category do you think he said comprised the majority of the verses in the Quran? Which one? The fourth category. Yeah. Where every human being can read the Quran and derive meaning. But does that mean that every human being can derive rulings? No. That's a specialization, and you go get trained for that and so on and so forth. So Who's the founder of the science? Al-Wadi'. There are a few different perspectives. First and foremost, we should know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put down this knowledge in the Quran itself. And there are multiple verses, right, that go into that. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Surah Al-Ikhlas is maybe the dominant understanding by which we know the beliefs that we have. All right? There are also verses, for instance, آمن الرسول بما أنزل إليه من ربه والمؤمنون كل آمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله لا نفرق بين أحد من رسله وقالوا سمعنا وأطعنا غفرانك ربنا وإليك المصير. So this verse, for instance, in Surah Al-Baqarah, is another area in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is clearly demarcating what are the beliefs that we must have as Muslims, as believers. But beyond that then, when you look at theology proper, like what are the things that I have to believe in? And how do I come to believe those things? And then beyond that, why are those things true? I mean, what's grounding my ability to say that those things are true? That turns in then to what we know as theology proper, or ilm al-kalam. And the historical context then that leads Muslims to render it in a way that allows them to tackle the predominant ideologies of their time. So, how do we respond to people who say that God doesn't actually have real attributes? Right? That all of the attributes are basically just Him. Or how do we respond, for instance, to people who say that there is no predestination? You are the one who are both responsible for the choices that you make, and you're creating those choices. And God is not really in the picture insofar as how that's all working. How do you respond to that? Okay? So the scholars then have to formulate what's known as this process of systematic theology. And the first people to do it, insofar as our tradition of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, were Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. And these scholars did so in a way that both understood how to ground everything that they were doing in the source texts, as well as how one would in fact be able to derive those beliefs as being true and put them into engagement with public life to address the concerns of the community at that time. And again, just something to think about in relationship to the way that we're building our institutions right now. I mean, how much do we invest in people? Human beings who we know have the ability to do this type of work, and we recognize it as being central to us being a community, a thriving community, flourishing. We have to have people who are going to be able to give us the types of responses that we'll be proud of, who are tackling the issues of our day, evolution, quantum mechanics, and quantum physics. You know, I get a lot of questions from people on a daily basis around these particular types of issues. You know, how do we substantiate our classical understanding of theology with something like quantum mechanics? Does that work anymore? Yeah. And all of these things need responses. And mashallah, tabarakallah, you look at the Christian community, they have a lot of people set up in a lot of places doing this type of work. The Jewish community similarly. The Muslim community, not so much. But inshallah, I think we're beginning to make some steps, alhamdulillah. So these are the first two from within the schools of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah who are really able to encapsulate this idea, reconciling between both what is known as revelation and reason. When have we gone beyond the bounds of reason? And when are we completely neglecting the idea of the human intellect? Those things have to be reconciled and understood properly. Okay? And all of these things, as I said before, are all grounded in the Quran itself. So the primary dalil that we're going to be looking at, the proof or the arguments that we're going to be looking at, are based on the fact that the mutakallimun said that the world began. And based on our understanding that the world began, we will be able to prove the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as fact. So one could say, well, where did they get this from? Well, they got it from the Quran itself. كَمَا بَدَأْنَا أَوَّلَ خَلْقٍ نُعِيدُ. As we began the first creation, we will repeat it. قُلْ يُحْيِيهَا الَّذِي أَنْشَأَهَا أَوَّلَ مَرَّةٍ وَهُوَ بِكُلِّ خَلْقٍ عَلِيمٌ. Say, He will give them life who produced them the first time, and He is of all creation knowing. So this is where these ideas come from, and yet they were able to substantiate these things properly in a way that was rooted in reason. Right? So, that becomes a huge topic later on. What is the role of revelation? And what is the role of reason? And how do these two things come together? And do you really need to prove the existence of God? Okay? Just know that the overwhelming majority of ulama in relationship to this question said that our understanding in terms of how we're coming about these particular proofs is the following. When we talk to one another as Muslims, we can talk in a way that's based in revelation. And as a matter of fact, that becomes sort of the basis behind how we speak to one another. Do this, don't do this. Hey, I heard about this. How did you hear about this? And then I recite a verse in the Quran, or I give you a hadith. Correct? So, okay. What happens though if somebody from next door over here comes over and they say, hey, can you tell me why you think your religion is the true religion? And the only thing that you can say to them is, well, because the Quran says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد. Say, okay, yeah, I understand. It sounds really nice, but I don't really believe in the Quran. So now what? Is it only true in the sense that we can understand it because the Quran tells us that? Or is there another way for us to say that this is actually true and verify that claim? And that's what this course is going to get us to also recognize. Because if the only way that we could prove that, in fact, Islam is the true religion would be through the Quran itself, it would be circular reasoning. Doesn't make any sense. Correct? Yeah? Anybody have any objections? Anybody want to raise some ideas? Okay. We'll talk more about this, inshallah. So that becomes then the reason why we have dalil aqli and dalil naqli. We have proofs that are based in naql, revelation, and we have proofs that are based in reason. The proofs that are based in naql are for me and you, the Muslims. And the proofs that are based in the aql are for the non-Muslim, everybody. And in fact, they will give us the basis behind how we come to understand why our religion is true. Which, as we said before, is mandated upon us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself. ليه? Because He says, فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Have knowledge that there is no deity except God. And to have ilm means that you've in fact encapsulated both what and what? You've known. If you have knowledge of something, you know both what and why. You know both what and you know why. So what are some names of this science? One of the names that Abu Hanifa radiallahu ta'ala anhu called it was al-fiqh al-akbar. It's a very beautiful name actually. Al-fiqh al-akbar. The higher fiqh. He called it the higher fiqh because it's fiqh, number one, and it's akbar. Higher, in the sense that it's foundational. Okay? Unlike the way that we term fiqh today, which is that we're talking about legal rulings. It's also called usul al-din, the foundations of the religion, or ilm al-tawheed, the knowledge of the oneness of God, or ilm al-aqidah, ilm al-kalam, so on and so forth. All right? The sources that we have in relationship to this science is al-istimdad, the Quran, the Sunnah, as well as the consensus of the community, ijma', and the rational proofs. All right? And we'll come to understand this further, inshallah. Number 9, what's the legal ruling of this science? Is this something that just some of us in the community have to know? Or is it something that every single person has to know? Every single person has to know it. What's known as fard ayn. Okay? Fard ayn. Now, in relationship to what that is, then it's just the general understandings of these things. The reason why we're going through a very basic matan of aqidah. And lastly, the conceptualization of the science being that you come to know the why. Proofs that are derived at through pure reason and logic, and then proofs that are arrived at through the texts. Ilahiyat, divinity, nubuwat, prophetology, and sam'iyat, wahi, revelation, inshallah. So, let us begin. So, begin, I thought, whatever, all of that. That was just the foundation for the foundation. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So he begins Matn al-Aqidah al-Tawheediyya of الإمام أحمد بن محمد الدردير المالكي رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. فيقول يجب على المكلف معرفة ما يجب لله تعالى ولأنبيائه وملائكته الكرام فيجب لله تعالى 20 صفة. So he begins by saying يجب على المكلف يجب على المكلف معرفة. The first term يجب here, meaning it's an obligation. واجب. What does wajib mean? You must. It's mandatory. What happens if you don't do it? To sin. To sin. Right. So here we're talking about the legal implication, wajib, which would be different than we're talking about it in terms of a rational obligation. So which one is it? So yajib here, or the wajib here, is in relationship to hukm al-shar'i. All right? Which brings us to the first thing that we need to square away, and that is the topic of epistemology. How do we know what we know? What are the sources of knowledge? So for those of you writing, you can write sources of knowledge in Islam. The first one is al-hukm al-shar'i. Al-hukm al-shar'i. Legal judgments. So what are legal judgments? Legal judgments are judgments that you come to know by divine revelation. Al-hukm al-shar'i are judgments that you come to know through revelation. Meaning what? Meaning that after the sun reaches 1 degree past the meridian, the zenith, you have to pray dhuhr. Is there any way for me to rationally arrive there? To know something like that? No. Is there any way for me to empirically verify that claim? No. So how do you know that? Because the Sharia tells me. Angels exist. After you die, 2 angels are going to come to you and ask you 3 questions. Right? What is your religion? Who is your God? What is your religion? Who's your prophet? Then there's going to be this thing called Judgment Day. Then after Judgment Day, there's going to be 2 places that people will go to They're called hell and heaven. How would you know those things? How would you ever be able to arrive at those things? The only way that you can arrive at those things is that some revelatory understanding, right, was in fact given to you. A prophet of God who knew something of the unseen from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself told you that these things are true. Hukum shar'i. The second one is what's known as Hukum al-adi. Hukum adi. Empirical judgments. And empirical judgments are things that you come to know through observations and repeated patterns in nature, for instance. All right? So, can somebody give me an example of this? What's that? The sun and the moon. What about the sun and the moon? Right, so the seasons. So you come to know, for instance, that the fall is going to come at this particular time of year and the spring is going to come at this particular time of year. Good. Hukum adi. That's an empirical judgment that you come to know through observations and repeated patterns. What happens if I let go of this cup? Which way will it go? Go down. How do you know that? How do you know gravity? Hukum adi. Okay? These are things that you have come to learn through your observations of the world and the patterns that you have experienced those things. So you know that if there's tea in here, most likely it's what? Hot or cold? Hot. Right? If there's Gatorade in here, it's most likely what? Cold. Okay? I just had Gatorade for the first time again in like a very long time. Reminded me like when I used to play soccer back in the day. You understand what I'm saying though here, right? There's observations, you come to know them through these observations. These oftentimes get understood today as like the laws of nature, they call them, right? Or the laws of physics, for instance. All of these would be grouped within this particular understanding. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the hukum adi. The last one is known as hukum al-aqli. Hukum aqli. Rational judgments. Okay? And rational judgments are coming into an understanding of a thing based on pure reason alone. And without ever having to see it, nor anybody telling you that that's the case. Can somebody give me an example of this? What is something that you can know and you never had to see it and nobody had to come and tell you that that's the case? You'll drown if you can't swim. Okay. How many people here agree with that? Seems like you're out. Okay. Gravity? So how do you come to know gravity? You can rationally deduce that? No. Let me give you an example. 2 plus 2 is what? 4. Okay. I think maybe some people need more tea. 4, right? It's 4. How did you come to know that? Really? Okay. Good. So now we're arriving there. So foundationally, we understand some stuff. Okay? So I know what 2 means. Can anybody show me the number 2 in the building here? Can somebody show me where the number 2 is? You can't. You abstract it, it's a number, you understand what that means. Okay? And then I say plus, and you understand what that means. 2 equals, you can arrive at an understanding without ever having to see it. You abstract, you imagine those things, and you arrive at the conclusion in and of itself, what's known as a self-evident proposition. So mathematical propositions are in fact how we fundamentally come to understand this category. 2 plus 2 equals 4, okay? And you can go on in terms of whatever equations you know. Yeah? But there are other ones as well that aren't mathematical. For instance, you can say an object is either moving or at rest. I always have somebody in the audience who's always like, well, one time I was in the elevator and like I wasn't moving, right, but the elevator was moving. No. I'm talking about absolutely still and absolutely moving, okay? You can't have both of those things at the same time. And you don't have to see that in order to know that it's actually true. The whole is greater than the part. These are, in fact, definitive truths. They're self-evident. The evidence for them being true is in the statement itself. Does everybody understand what I'm saying here? These are things that logic are able to give you an understanding of, void of ever having to see it, and void of ever having to be revealed some sort of knowledge that's of the unseen. Why do you think that this category is really important? Let me ask you this question. Why do you think it's really important that you are able to establish that there are actually things that you can know without ever having to see it? What relevance would that have to a religion? Is that, oh yeah. Some people in here are still like, I don't get it. Can you see God? Did anybody ever from within the Muslim community say, I can prove God exists and show him to you? Yes or no? No. So if you're going to establish that as something that's actually true, then you're going to do so on the basis that there's an epistemology involved here that allows you to arrive at that conclusion. And fundamentally speaking, then, you've now opened up a whole category of understanding that's based in truths that are not dependent on your seeing it or observing it in order to establish its veracity. Does that make sense? So that's why this thing is very, 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 very important. Okay? It's also the point of departure for theology. And the reason why it's the point of departure for theology is because it's the common denominator between all human beings. There's no cultural bias to the understanding that I have an intellect and I'm able to arrive at particular truths because I'm Egyptian or something like that, and you don't have that because you're whatever. Okay? If you're a human being, and essentially speaking what the ulama actually said the human being was hayawan natiq, the rational animal, okay, means then that insofar as you simply being a human being, you have the ability to know things through the intellect. And that's what we share, void of our culture, our language, our experiences, whatever. The fact that we share that in common allows us then to arrive at certain conclusions that would be similar. And the most fundamental of all of those conclusions are going to be God exists. And we can prove it. How can you prove it? Through the intellect. Everybody get it? Everybody good? Okay. All right, so he says, يَجِبُ عَلَى الْمُكَلَّفِ مَعْرِفَةً. So what is a mukallaf? So he says it's obligatory upon the morally responsible or the morally culpable person to know. All right? The mukallaf, the morally responsible person in the religion, is defined through three things primarily. The first one is that they're post-pubescent. They've reached an age of puberty. The second thing is that they're aqil, meaning that they have a sound mind, they have a sound intellect. And the third thing is that وَصَلَتْ لَهُ الْعَقِيدَةُ الصَّحِيحَةُ. And this is very important. The third thing is that the true message has reached them. The true message, i.e. of Islam, has in fact reached them. What does that mean then for somebody who hasn't had the message reach them? According to the dominant opinion, then they're not obligated to anything. I mean, they may have social responsibilities, but insofar as their relationship with God, somebody who went their whole life and never received the message of Islam properly, in order for them to attain that truth, we believe, in fact, that individual goes to heaven. And that's the dominant opinion. There are other opinions. What that also means then is that moral culpability is something that only comes once revelation comes. You're not morally culpable for things within the religion until the religion itself is revealed. And that also has a huge implication in relationship to how then maybe we speak about those who may not have in fact received the religion. And I mean, one of the books that any student of knowledge in the room really should get acquainted with is Imam al-Ghazali's Faisal al-Tafriqa, because he actually goes into all of the different delineations that one comes to understand this particular topic. Meaning, he talks about, for instance, what about the individual in the religion who may have, in fact, known something about Islam, like he knew Islam was around, came, like today's world, but the only thing that he knew about Islam was like what Fox News broadcasts. And like the only thing that he understands about the religion, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, are these horrible things that they say. And that's all they know. And they're just sort of, stuck in that. Imam Ghazali said even that person would not be held liable. Okay? So it means that the religion itself, the truth of the religion itself, had to have been made manifest to this person. And this is actually going back to the root of this term, kufr, or disbelief. Kufr meaning, it's coming actually from a root word meaning to cover something. They used to talk about it in relationship to like the fallahin, the farmers who plant their seed, وَيُكَثِّرْ, right, and would cover it. Meaning in relationship to this concept that an individual knows something to be true and they cover it up. You know something and you pretend that you don't know it. You hide it. That's really what we're talking about at the end of the day. Yeah? And so, again, it has massive implications on our discussions about religion in the modern world and theology and so on and so forth. يجب على المكلف. So that's the first notion now. بالغ العاقل. Somebody who is post-pubescent, we said, who has a sound mind, and who the da'wah has reached them properly, is a mukallaf. Ma'rifah. Ma'rifah here really is being used as, we're just going to replace it with ilm. Okay? And what we mean here is ضد الجهل, the opposite of ignorance. And we've talked, I think, extensively about that. There's a lot more we can say, but alhamdulillah, just the first class. ما يجب لله ولأنبيائه وملائكته الكرام. All right. So, it's obligatory for the morally responsible person to know what is necessary for God and His prophets and His angels. So now we're using the same term, yajib, here, but we're not talking about it in the same way that we just talked about shar'i obligations, legal obligations. This connotation implies a rational obligation rather than a legal one, which means essentially the concept of rational necessity. Okay? And a definition of something that is necessary is such that if you were to assume that it were not true, then something impossible, absurd, or a contradiction, a logical contradiction, would arise. So an example of something that is necessary is, for instance, like we said, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Or that God necessarily exists. Okay? Those are things that are necessary. Yeah, the definition we would say, if you assume that it does not exist, a logical contradiction would arise. All right? So 2 plus 2 has to equal 4. It's inconceivable, and this is kind of where we're getting at in terms of epistemology here. The classical laws of logic were, the law of non-contradiction was one of them. All right? Then you have the law of the excluded middle and the law of identity. You don't have to get into all of it. The law of non-contradiction here, okay, and what these rules are really sort of getting at is we all have an intellect, like we've said, and if we're going to come into an understanding of anything, we have to grant that there are certain laws by which the intellect is able to arrive at certain truths, i.e. what would be conceivable. And then there are things that are completely inconceivable to the mind. Like what? Like saying X is Y and X is not Y at the same time, just to give you something abstract. All right? You can't have both. Somebody can say, well, I want to have both. That's fine. It's inconceivable. I can't think of something in that way. I'm unable to arrive at any truth claim in relationship to this. 2 plus 2 equals 7. 1 is 3. I have no way of reconciling that. It's inconceivable to the mind to be able to reconcile that claim. Does everybody understand that? All right? This is obviously going to be a huge deal because when we talk about our Christian brethren, they're going to try to find ways to maneuver around this idea. Okay? And so we have to think about, well, maybe for them then they have a different model that they're going to try to substantiate their claims through. And we don't have to have that model. Why? Because we're not trying to say things that would be inconceivable to the mind. And that has an implication then in relationship to how we understand fitrah as well. Okay? Everybody clear on that? Like if we're going to have a conversation and like you can understand what I'm saying and I can understand what you're saying and these things, i.e. that the intellect is sufficient in order for me to arrive at truth, then I have to have some basis by which that truth is going to be substantiated. Classically, it was understood as the laws of logic. All right? And then you can see now, maybe some of you could see why things like quantum mechanics and whatnot pose such a great issue for people. Because you get to the quantum level and things begin to get a little crazy, right? So, but we could talk a little bit more about that if anybody has any questions. Okay, so we said what is necessary, meaning things that must hold in order for us to even be talking about God. All right? Things that are necessary for God. Now this language sometimes when you first hear it, you think like, man, that seems necessary for God. It's not something necessary for God. We could say, for instance, okay, God has to, which is what we mean by necessary, be God. Everybody agree? God has to be alive. Anybody in here want to argue that God doesn't have to be alive? Okay. He's beyond.
Something beyond even what our comprehension of what it is to be alive. Like,
Okay.
it might be something so more fundamentally bigger than that that we can't even conceive.
So I think that that's,
We reach the limit of
yeah.
conception by stopping at alive, but really, I kind of feel like it's probably something way more than that. But I don't know.
So if we were to define alive as just not dead, sure, it does. You're right. The point here is that do you need the Quran to substantiate that God is alive? Because remember how we're going about trying to come into these understandings. I mean, yes, that's definitely, that's where we're going to root ourselves, essentially speaking. But if I were to simply say to somebody who's not a Muslim, hey, God is alive, and he necessarily must be alive, do you think that there's an actual challenge to that? So the idea that he transcends life, okay? In a way, you can say, look, what does it even mean to be alive? And I get that. And even individuals today who are doing research in areas like this would tell you, we don't really have an answer. We simply know life as something that's self-evident. We recognize it as opposed to something that's dead. So if you were to simply grant that general understanding, you would say it's impossible for God to be dead, and it's necessary, if it's impossible for him to be dead, then it's necessary that he's alive. As a matter of fact, nobody from amongst all of the different firaq al-Islamiyya would have an issue with this, right? Because it's something that's just so fundamental. But what we're really doing is just substantiating the idea that you don't need revelation in order to arrive at that truth. As a matter of fact, you would, at a certain level, hope that you could substantiate that claim, and then from there come to recognize that this is what the Quran is itself substantiating. Based on what? Based on the fact that it's fundamental to the very way that I come to know anything at all about life. So if I were to want to say, well, let's entertain the idea that God could be dead, billah, at that point, all meaning is gone, khalas. We just live in a very sort of skeptic type of world at that point. So this is what these categories are doing. They're saying, listen, you know this, you never had to see it before. All right? God is necessarily one. It's impossible for him to be two. And so on and so forth. And we'll get into all of that, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But does that make sense? Does that kind of begin to work out some of those things? I mean, again, we can talk more about this notion of life itself, but I think that that's, for the most part, how we're going to grant this system. We could talk more afterwards. مَا يَجِبُ لِلَّهِ. So wujuban here is we're talking about, again, what is necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have. فيجب لله تعالى 20 صفة وهي الوجود والقدم والبقاء والمخالفة للحوادث والقيام بالنفس والوحدانية والحياة والعلم والإرادة والقدرة والسمع والبصر والكلام وكونه تعالى حيا وعليما ومريدا وقادرا وسميعا وبصيرا ومتكلما. Okay, so we're going to try to get through, actually we're done, but we'll try to get through that section that I talked about in the next in the next class. And then from there, we'll go into what are the things that we come to know about prophets. And then the last category is sam'iyat, right? Any questions? So just as a recap here, we went through again all of the other components about what the science of Tawheed in fact is covering. And then we went through how we come to know things. What are the sources of knowledge? So what are they? There are three. Hukum Shar'i, it's a legal judgment. Second one, Hukum Adi, it's a, what is it? Empirical judgment. And the third, Hukum Aqli, which is a rational judgment. Okay? How do I know what 100 plus 100 equals? What category is that? Hukum Aqli, yeah. If I let go of this cup, it will fall down. What category is that? Hukum Adi, okay, empirical judgment. Fire is hot. Hukum Adi, good. The use of suwak is sunnah. You know suwak, you know the brush that the Prophet has. That's a sunnah. What type of judgment is that? Hukum Shar'i, good. Asr prayer is fard. Shar'i, good. A person can't be in two places at the same time. Good. Good. All right. That's really good. So when we talk about this, again, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, it's very important recognizing, having a proper understanding of these three categories cannot be overstressed, because these categories form the criteria, the sort of epistemic criteria of Islamic knowledge. And a person who knows the difference between a hukum shar'i and a hukum aqli, a rational judgment, an empirical judgment, and a legal judgment, they have the proper tools to be able to do sound theological investigation. And those who don't have that, okay, they can't make the distinction between these categories, and particularly of empirical and of rational judgments, they're going to have serious issues in their religious methodologies. For example, I'll give you an example as to why. God says in the Quran that He commanded the fire, Kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. Right? He commanded the fire not to burn, but to be cool and peaceful upon the Prophet Abraham. Now, if one assumes that fire necessarily burns, that they're able to see, and that's an empirical judgment, that fire burns, and they then recognize that as a rational judgment, they think that that's something that, if it were not the case, you would have a logical contradiction, like we said before. At that point then, you're going to arrive at three conclusions. Okay? The first thing that you're going to say is, well, hold on a second. The Quran is saying that Ibrahim a.s. was thrown into the fire and he didn't burn. But it's a logical necessity that fire must burn him. And I'm able to derive that vis-a-vis my empirical observation of that thing. All right? Then you arrive at one of three conclusions. The first one, the Quran said something that's not true. Therefore, you're in a big hole now. The second thing that you can say is, okay, well, fire doesn't actually mean fire. And you'll find some allegorical understanding or some sort of cognitive alteration around what fire means in this particular instance. You'll say, well, fire means hardship, right? Or that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created a ring around the fire, and that's what Ibrahim alayhi salam actually fell into. He didn't actually fall into fire, as the falasifa, for instance, in the tradition did. Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and these people. That was their interpretation. All right? And in fact, in arriving at that interpretation, you completely do away with the idea of miracles. There's no more miracles. Okay? The third option, which has become kind of, for some reason, an attractive model in the world that we live in today, is to say, look, the fire didn't burn him in this instance through the divine command, but we do know that fire must necessarily burn based on our observation of fire. And yeah, it doesn't really make sense, but religion doesn't have to make sense. It's not about aql. Religion is actually not about aql. It doesn't have to be about aql. Now, again, this may seem attractive for certain people who just want to say whatever, but you're going to have to reconcile a whole number of issues now. Okay? The first one is that, what did we say moral accountability is based on? The mukallaf. What's a mukallaf? Puberty, and what was the other one? Sound intellect. Okay, so if you're basing the whole notion of accountability in religion on the intellect, and now you're saying you don't really need intellect, that's pretty problematic. All right? The other is that it doesn't really provide an academically plausible methodology when you're trying to argue for the truth of Islam over the truth of other religions. So as an implication of such, this approach is going to be forced then to advance this sort of academically dishonest approach to their methods. So if a Christian comes up to you and he says, hey, tell me why your religion is true. Well, if you're going to stay consistent to this methodology that you don't really need aql and you don't need to reconcile these types of things, then you'll just say, I can't. I just believe in it. Which now makes you no different than somebody else who says, I just believe in mine. Okay. So then there's no more truth anymore. It's just your truth and my truth and his truth and that person's truth, and everybody just has their own truth. Right? So there's no objective truth anymore. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for instance, on the Day of Judgment is going to call you and say, hey, what did you do with the mind that I gave you? And you're going to say, well, yeah, it wasn't sufficient. The intellect was insufficient for me to arrive at truth. That's really what these people are saying. The intellect is insufficient in order for me to arrive at truth. And that is absolutely not true. The intellect that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you is perfectly equipped to arrive at truth. And it's the whole basis of your creation. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I haven't created the spirits and mankind except for human beings, except to worship me. And as Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhuma said about worship here, he said it meant to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ الْمَعْرِفَةِ. How are you going to arrive there if you're saying the intellect doesn't matter, reason doesn't matter? Yeah? And that we know that that's not the case, right? Because these people who say you don't need intellect, you don't need aql, the minute that somebody from another faith comes to them and asks them, prove to me Islam is the truth, off to the races they go with aql. Is that consistent? Is that even academically honest in terms of what your approach is? It's not. Right? So we'll continue bi'idhnillahi ta'ala next week. You had one question here and then we'll end. Right. And again, I think that we talked a little bit about it in the beginning, but where does reason fit in the scope of our understanding of the religion? And when have we in fact transgressed the bounds of reason? I mean, that's something that we also have to know as well. But we should also know that, no, you don't, I mean, the idea that you're just supposed to believe and not question, right? I mean, is it real belief? Do you actually believe it? That's what has to be really sort of poked at that point, is to say, if I believe, and belief for us is ilm, knowledge, فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Can you really believe something unless you know why it's true? You think it's sufficient for you to just say, well, I believe this because my parents believed it? That's the disconnect that we have right now in the community, I'm telling you. Like, that's not something, that's not a small thing. And we may not see it within certain segments of our community, but it's very alive in other segments of the community, where it's just like, for most youth today that I speak to, for instance, they're just like, hey, look, man, do I really have to believe this stuff in order for me to even be a good person? Like, I just don't understand it. I don't get it. Like, why do I have to go into a mosque and pray in order for me to be a good person? I feel like I can be a good person and not have to do those types of things, and I'm just doing it really because mama and baba want me to do that, so I'm just kind of there. That's what we're going to raise if we're not addressing the question of, no, God is real, and here's how you get there. Yeah. Why do you go? The assumption is that because Allah is real. Yeah, and I think the explanation has to begin with God exists. And God is to be understood in a particular way. And you're not like that. And once you come to recognize that and you recognize the authenticity then, right, the validity of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you arrive at a deep understanding as to why anything that they say, I now know I should be doing it. Because it is God, and He is a Prophet, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to have a good understanding of our religion. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow this understanding to permeate our hearts and our families' hearts and our communities' hearts بإذن الله تعالى. هذا وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. الحمد لله رب العالمين. بارك الله فيكم. And sorry for if I went over a little bit. بارك الله فيكم.